I want to take a couple of minutes to review some possible options for presenting data on facility self-harm rates on the Commissioner's dashboard. Rather than report the psychologist or the regional score for suicide prevention, I would strongly prefer to present changes in self-harm rates because they are a better stick-to-the-knitting measure of emerging problems in suicide prevention. The question becomes, how do you present self-harm data? As I believe I can show, different methods for displaying the data can elicit very different conclusions by the consumer. So what way is the best way to represent the data? Let's look at the data for some characteristics, as the data suggests some ground rules. Let's see what the data have to say. Let's start with an example to clarify how the data is presented. These are the self-harm rates for YDCs during December. Note the green line marks the 6-month average for all YDCs. I think this is the best baseline against which to measure YDC performance because it gives us a good stable look at how the system performs over a 6-month period. The yellow line represents one standard deviation above the 6-month average for all YDCs. In this example, note that Eastman, Macon, and Sumter are all above the yellow line. The red line represents 2 standard deviations above the 6-month average for all YDCs. And note in this example that Augusta YDC is above the red line. Next, I want to note that RYDCs and YDCs are very different. The standard deviation between rates in the RYDCs is far, far lower than the standard deviation between rates in the YDCs. The standard deviation in the RYDCs is just 0.037, while the standard deviation for the YDCs is 0.355. So the variation in the YDCs is almost 10 times the variation in the RYDCs. On this basis, I'm recommending the comparisons between facilities be separated by RYDC and YDC status. So the scorecard will compare RYDCs with RYDCs and YDCs with YDCs. Even given that distinction, should we compare facilities against statewide averages or against their own past performance? These questions produce very different answers, and both of the answers are important. Let's set up rules for the 2 different ways of looking at the variation between self-harm rates. First, let's set up a rule for comparing facility self-harm rates against a system's 6-month average. To determine if a facility's self-harm rate is significantly above the rate of other similar facilities, we compare that facility's current rate against the 6-month average of all facilities. If the facility's current self-harm rate is 2 standard deviations above the 6-month average, that facility would be coded red. If the facility's current self-harm rate is more than 1 standard deviation but less than 2 standard deviations above the 6-month average, that facility would be coded yellow. Finally, if a facility's rate is less than 1 standard deviation or is below the 6-month average for all facilities during the past 6 months, that facility would be coded as green. The application of that set of rules to YDCs produces the following dashboard. These results probably don't surprise anyone. December is traditionally a high month for self-harm, and the problems at Sumter, Eastman, Macon, and Augusta are well known. But the results for Augusta also illustrate the weakness with presenting data in this manner. Augusta is the site for the mental health unit, and will probably always have rates that are higher than the rest of the system. Simply because of the concentration of youth in the mental health unit, it is likely that Augusta is doomed to be in the red forever when using this method of comparison. And that doesn't really tell the whole story. Let's use the second method for constructing a dashboard where we compare sites against their own performance over the past 6 months. the picture for Augusta becomes very different. Here is a chart that compares the rate for Augusta during December against the rates for the previous 5 months. The chart clearly shows that Augusta had a big spike in September. It also shows that December was the best month for Augusta over the past 6-month period. If we use the coding system that compares one site against its own performance over the past 6 months, Augusta YDC would be coded green instead of red. There's actually a very similar situation in looking at the RYDC dashboard for December. Although I would need to compile data for other months to have any confidence in this statement, I suspect that it's quite unusual to have 5 sites in the red and 1 site in yellow for any particular month for RYDCs. Again, remember that the standard deviation for RYDCs is quite low, so these numbers are quite out of the ordinary. Perhaps there's a good demonstration of just how volatile December is and how much self-harm spikes during the holidays. Again, we'd need more information to be confident of that. But it's difficult to look at this chart and not think, oh my gosh, Decembers are trouble. But the situation with the Macon Girls RYDC is comparable to the situation at the Augusta YDC. Granted, this unit is closed, but if it had stayed open, we could reasonably expect that the rates at this facility would always be significantly higher than the rates at other RYDCs because it's the only all-girls facility in the system. When we look at the chart that compares December's performance for the previous 5 months, the situation is still alarming. December is the highest month in the 6-month reporting period, but it is only 1 standard deviation above the 6-month average for Macon RYDC, and thus would be coded yellow. Both methods for representing the data are accurate, and both ways of representing the data convey important information. So the question I'd like to ask is, which method would you prefer to use in presenting the data on the Commissioner's dashboard? Using the comparison with system data, the one where Augusta YDC always gets to be in the red, gives the best systems vantage point. Providing information which compares facility data with their own performance over a 6-month period provides a more sensitive assessment of facility performance. We could, I think, with adequate explanation, provide both columns of data. It might be worth producing that version and letting others in the office look and see if they find both sets of information interesting or just plain confusing.